have struggled some areas with the transition from or to remote learning. Our auxiliary services have struggled with providing necessary support, particularly around social emotional learning. And so that's been a transition, particularly in both larger districts where I came from in Wake County, but also small rural districts like Warren County, where we have, and we've seen that struggle across the state. If you look at some of the student performance data, we took a huge hit in terms of student outcomes and performance during the 2 years, the 18 months or so that we were in a remote learning atmosphere. And so what much of our attention, our focus, our investment across the state is looking at how we can accelerate learning for many of our students across the state, to look at the 18 months or so that we, again, we're in a virtual environment. And so we're at a crossroads, I think, here in North Carolina and in many of our counties as we look at how we innovate learning, how we improve learning, how we improve and innovate the delivery of teaching and learning for our students, as we look at how we use technology to further educate our students, how we use much of the, and for some of us like Warren County, be it not for the federal funding that we've received from the pandemic recovery funds, much of that, came through the state, but from the federal level, we've been able to look at how we can innovate teaching and learning in a way that our students, that meets the needs of our students. So we're looking at things such as, again, increasing student voice and student agency and hearing from students. What ways can we best reach students? What ways can we best innovate learning so that we are meeting the individual and personalized needs of our students? And so, as I said, we're at a crossroads, and many districts are working, superintendents, teachers, faculty, administrators are working to figure out how we can improve teaching and learning as we move forward in what we refer to as a blended learning environment. So that's, I think, sort of where we are at this point with respect to the state of education in North Carolina.
Thank you. Representative Smith, I know you were saying some things a little earlier when we were chatting. As far as the legislature, how involved are you all in trying to fix this gap and making sure that our students, and again, emphasizing our students of color with the D9 as well, making sure that they are moving forward? What are you all doing to help with this gap?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very hard question on my end. And the reason why it's a very hard question, because everything that's been mentioned already, we know that those are the challenges. When I think about what we're doing, one of the first things I think about is broadband. We are having to try to find what is the best way that we can address this broadband situation, because when the pandemic happened and people had to go to virtual learning, we know that many students were left behind. And they didn't have access. And we were doing things like putting hotspots in places, taking buses places with hotspots and things of that nature, which lets us know we need to make sure that we're working on our infrastructure. So we're working on that now. The issue is, what's the best way for that to happen? That's still going to be a challenge because we have so many people with so many different ideas and thoughts. So we're looking at that. But then we also, one main thing and major thing that we've been looking at, and it's been mental health. Because of that isolation for 5 months, that has created more issues than we could ever anticipate. That's why we had to fight about the mask, because they said the children needed to see people smile again. We were talking about the suicide rates in children that happened during the pandemic. And just looking at, in school, they had supports, right? When you're at home, you don't have those same supports. And we looked at the need, we're still looking at the needs for more social supports in the school, because to have one social worker for the entire school doesn't work. And so
Right.
we're trying to change those numbers. We're fighting to change those numbers. These are just the conversations we're having. I think the biggest challenge is making sure that we have that conversation with equity.
Mm.
Because many times when we have these conversations, we just have the conversations, but when it's time to divvy out where funds would go in order to make sure that we are allocating what's needed so everybody could get what's needed, because not everybody needs the same amount. That's where sometimes the struggle and the battle comes in. So we're continuing to have that. And I'm sure everyone is aware of Leandro. And if you're not, it really started here in the East with some lawsuits that were filed because of not having the appropriate funding for education to provide what they needed for students. And that Leandro case has been going on for quite some time. And so we had a judge that was working on it, and he got moved out and said that he retired. They retired him basically and put a new judge in the position to rule on it. And we're talking about what, $1.7 billion being given to the schools so that the teachers can do what they need to do to make sure they're taking care of all of the students. But we have a battle. And the battle is the General Assembly is saying they can't tell us how to spend the money. And if you talk to the secretary, he will tell you that we have excess right now. And if we have excess of, $4+ billion, and we looking for the 1.7 billion, they're still not willing to really give that out right now. So that's just the political struggle that we're going through. And that's why it's important that we're here. So I take every moment as a legislator to make sure that I try to educate individuals. And when people ask me, well, why is it important that we vote? This is why, because you're voting for people who do not feel that the students should be getting the proper funding so that they could be properly educated. Because if you're fighting against Leandro, that's the message that you're sending for so many people. Because the question has been, why would we not fight to give this money to students that may be falling behind, need the additional assistance, the things that we can do to keep them up? And just to make sure that you guys know, Leandro affects our students. It affects the people who look like you and I. And so it is important that we make sure that we stay on top of it, that we have our voices being heard, that we're advocating, that we're at our school board meetings, but you're calling these elected officials and letting them know. And we all know it's election time. They need to hear your voices. And if they hear you before the election, if they're looking for your vote, then I think it will be key for you to share with them your belief of Leandro being supported, because that might be able to make a difference. And if you don't have people who are willing to support that, then maybe your decision needs to be something that's different. It's pretty sad. And it's draining sometimes. It's tiring because you know what's right, but then you see what's happening on the opposite side. But guess what? You can't stop fighting. You got to keep going, and you can't use the excuse that they're just going to do what they're going to do. Well, they will if people stop fighting.
May I add something to what Representative
Absolutely,
said?
Secretary. And could either one of you all clarify the funding? Maybe you, Secretary Penny, because that was mentioned. How much funding was it with the ARP funds? I just wanted to make sure that was in there. Could you clarify?
Well, I think Keith can probably answer the ARP funding.
Okay.
I mean, there was additional funding because of ARP, a bunch of new programs, but you have to remember ARP is one-time funding. So you cannot do sustained recurring things with this one-time funding. One of the things that Representative Smith was saying is that we did this year, as we did last year, over what we call over collect. We collected more money. The economy was doing better. We collected more money than was anticipated. $4.24 billion. That's a billion with a B. All right. And what I would always tell my students in public administration is a budget is a priority. Now, people can tell you that they love what you're doing and that they love everything that you do, But if you're not in the budget, they don't care about you. Okay. And so budget is priority setting. And so when you have a $1.7 billion need that has been there for over 20 years, because the Leandro case came down, I think it was 25 years ago, if my memory, it's over 20 years. And now you have consistently overproduced. Then to not allocate funds appropriately is to say that that is not a priority. It's as simple as that. Now, so the question that all of the Divine Nine have to answer is, are those our priorities? Do those priorities match up with our priorities? And if they do, then you're fine. Vote the way, vote which, but if they don't, then you have to find those who are willing to match your priorities and stand up and have the ability and the gumption to stand up and fight for those priorities.
Absolutely. And to your point, do your homework and your research about candidates, because sometimes, I know we have people who have been elected officials. You have to do the research about where people are standing right now in 2022 and make sure they're supporting the causes in which you want to support, as well as the Divine Nine. We need to do that as well, too. So good points. I love it, which brings me to a point that was brought up, and I want you to answer also, Superintendent Sutton, about the ARP as well. But I wanted to throw out this question. We mentioned students, we mentioned teachers and support system. What about the parents and the inability for some of the parents, especially with our students who are of color, to keep up with helping them with the work? There are many educated parents on this call. And I can say for myself, I struggled trying to help my daughter with some of the homework, especially during COVID. So what are we doing also, Superintendent Sutton, to blend in parents and make sure that parents are a part of this, and or guardians, to make sure that the students have the support system that they need? Because that old saying, it takes a village to raise a child, it doesn't just stop in the school. It's got to, as you said, go to the home, but the home has to also be equipped. So is there any talk about that, and also the ARP funds, if you don't mind? And then I'll go to Representative Smith.
I'll start with the funding. I can't tell you the latest number in terms of what has come from both the state and federal government in that funding. You're talking hundred millions of dollars that have come in over the last 2 years, and it's come in waves. So you're talking about the first wave that came into the state to help with equipment and safety. So things like PPE and sanitizer and those sort of things. The second wave of money came, and it was focused on transitioning from health and safety to learning recovery. So summer learning programs and helping to recover lost learning over the last couple of years. And then the third wave was focused on both social emotional health and wellness of students and adults and teachers in the building, as well as innovation in education. So again, looking at how we might transform learning in response to what we're seeing from the pandemic. And you've seen anywhere from upwards of $300 million or so going to the larger districts like Charlotte and Wake County, to 12 million or so coming to smaller counties like Warren County and others. So you're talking about upwards of $500 to $600 million or more that is coming to the state. But to Secretary Penny's point, that is limited funding. We have until 2024 to spend that money. And so after that, it runs out. And so while that has been a significant infusion of cash, and we're talking about unprecedented levels of investment in public education. We didn't see this kind of money in Race to the Top when Obama was president. So this is the biggest infusion of cash we've seen, in my view, in the history of our country and putting into public education. So it's going to be important about how we as appointed officials, elected officials, and parents and communities lean in on thinking about how we invest this money in our schools, in our communities, and in education. And so one, to your other point about parents and community engagement, as we've been talking about elected officials, it is important for parents and the community to weigh in with school board members, their local, state, and federal elected officials about how we want to see this money spent and used in our communities. Some of that money also is set aside for improving parent and community engagement, along with current money such as our Title I federal funds. That there is a significant amount of money that is designated in every district for parent and community engagement. And so we as education leaders have to be thoughtful about how we do that and how we look at engaging our parents, especially now that we're using technology more than ever to educate our students and finding ways to include parents in that conversation. What are the best ways to do that when we're in a virtual learning environment? How are we able to increase the level of both, I think, accountability and responsibility, because there is more responsibility on the parents and the home structure to make sure that students are online when we're in that virtual environment, but also being that extra person that is there, that support that's there to provide that support to our students, both from an academic, social emotional space. And so recognizing when students are struggling, when they are having some frustration, being isolated and that sort of things Representative Smith has talked about, that we are being both vigilant, I think, and responsible in terms of, again, how much screen time students were seeing and that sort of thing. And so any of those things all of those things I think are important. And, we're not out of this pandemic yet. And so at any time we could see perhaps going back in some way or some level to a virtual or blended learning environment that combines both face-to-face instruction and virtual instructions when what I'm talking about when we refer to a blended learning environment. So that's some things that we are thinking about in terms of both the parent and community engagement piece and the funding as well. So I hope I answered both questions.
You did. And I'll roll over to Representative Smith, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are, because I know several of the districts take the devices back for the summer, from the students. And that's a huge gap where they could be, practicing and doing things over the summer, but they have no broadband, access. They have no computer devices. So could some of that money be spent to come up with programs for summer? Because every student may not have to go to summer school, but they have no device at this point because they've been taken, because now it's EOG time focus. So if that makes sense, my second part of it. And then I'll go to you, Representative Smith. Do you all keep your devices over the summer, Superintendent Sutton?
We have, so you've had quite a few districts like Warren County and even Wake County when I was there to some degree that were forced to go to one-to-one device situations. And by that, I mean every student having a computer. And in a lot of situations, we were also distributing hotspots to those students as well. Some of those districts, perhaps like Warren County, were forced, and I say forced, to go to one-to-one when we were not quite ready to be a one-to-one district. And so while it was good on one hand that we were able to get devices in the hands of students, and in some cases we had to rush to get those devices in the hands of students. When you look at inventory management systems and being able to track those devices once they were out there, we didn't have the systems and procedures in place for that. And so in some situations, we've left those devices in the hands of students. And of course, as you can imagine, some of those devices we've never seen again.
Right, right.
And so that sort of the fear and sort of, I guess, the balance we're trying to manage in terms of being able to get those devices out and allow students to keep those devices, while at the same time making sure that we're able to keep track of those devices and provide repair to those devices when they're needed. If a student has a cracked screen on a Chromebook or a laptop, then that doesn't really do them much good if they can't use it. And of course, we've tried to make sure that we're not, or nobody's charging students for those repairs and that sort of thing. And so there's funding there to help provide the needed repairs, replacement of those devices after they've had them for a year and a half, 2 years, and that there are devices in the classrooms as well.
Right.
So in many cases, we see students take those devices, but when they don't bring them back, then we don't have a device in the classroom for them to do their work as well. So just some of the logistical challenges and things that we have to think about as we're getting devices, pushing those things out and making sure that we're able to track those devices and their proper inventory management systems to keep track of them.
Thank you. Very good point. Thank you. Representative Smith, what's your take on all this?
Oh, when you ask me about the parents, I think that that's probably more addressed more with Superintendent Sutton, because they're working with the parents and with the students. The only thing I think about when I look at the funds that was sent out, and they talked about what the funds could be used for, part of it talked about investing in water and sewer and broadband infrastructure. Well, that's where I think that it affects the parents, because if they had those things, even something as simple as a cell phone could still be used. But you have some people who have a cell phone and don't have service in the area.
Right.
I was just talking to the cell phone company and letting them know that I don't have service from a certain area, and they looked it up and said, yeah, we don't have it, we're borrowing the towers. Well, can students who live in the rural areas, because we have many of them, can they use that excuse if we're trying to get them to do the work? No, they cannot. And so I think that the way that we can help those parents is make sure that we do have that broadband infrastructure there. And then also I think that we need to make sure that we're providing premium pay for our essential workers. I think that we've not talked about this, and I'm sure the superintendent probably wouldn't say it because he's a superintendent trying to make sure he stays politically correct. But one main thing I think about is we have lost a number of teachers, and losing these teachers, how can we expect the students who were already behind because of the pandemic to catch up? They were behind in math and in science, those critical areas that we need in order for them to go to the next grade.
Right.
And so we're looking now at trying to hire teachers, because if we're not paying them, we have teachers. Someone gave an example of going to the Cheesecake Factory and seeing a teacher there being a waitress at the Cheesecake Factory because they made more than they did teaching. And so we are trusting our most precious commodity with the teachers, but then we're not willing to give them the funds to take care of themselves, their families, and all during a pandemic. When this money came in, we're supposed to be using it when it talks about health and everything else. We have to understand when Secretary Penny said, basically he said, put your money where your mouth is. If we're not willing to put our money where our mouth is, then it really doesn't matter. Because everybody can say good job. Everybody can agree with you, ooh, that's a good point. But with looking at this budget and how we give these funds out, and looking at the ARPA funds and how this money is being used, all of that determines where people really think the priority is. And so that's, to me, one of the major issues that I see. And we look at it within education, but then you also look at it when it comes to locally, because the different cities, towns, they received ARPA funding and they're doing the same thing. I've seen these cities and towns spend money on parks versus spending money on the people. And they know it's a crisis. We're looking at how many people have already died from COVID, and it's not over. And individuals seem to think that it is over. But we're We have issues that we need to make sure that we're funding. We have small businesses that are struggling. We have individuals who are afraid to go back into the schools and into the workforce because of, how we are. In my opinion, I think sometimes we overstep our bounds. Our job as legislators we're looking at the policies and what might need to be adjusted, corrected to make it better for North Carolinians. It is not to go in and try to micromanage what the professionals are doing. And I think we do a bit too much of that. And if we get too personal and we become upset because someone comes to advocate for themselves and then we withhold money because of that, then that begins to be an issue. So we have a lot to work with. But I will always say this, we as legislators, we cannot do it by ourselves. It takes you all to make sure that you're fighting with us and for us and holding us accountable, because even I need to be accountable for the decisions I make, for the fights that I fight for. I serve on the education committee. I need to be in that education committee fighting and speaking for the people, what they're asking me for. And if you don't have individuals willing to do that, whether they're nice or not, because I don't really care about the party, whether they're nice or not, that's not doing what you need them to do in order to take care of your kids and to take care of your family and to make sure we're taking care of all of North Carolinians. So I would say, North Carolina, we have a problem. No need to say, we don't have to go as far as Houston.
Representative Smith, if I had a mic, I would drop the mic right now, sister. I just drop the mic. Thank you. Everything you said, including my next question, you were right there with me. So thank you. Which is the lead in for Secretary Penny? We just kind of talked about teachers' pay. Teachers were our lifeline during COVID, whether they were online trying to make things work in a different environment, or even in the classroom now with all the ups and downs. Inflation is at an all-time high. I think I have to get gas today and I'm frightened to go to the pump. It's probably $5 when I go to look. When we have the teachers' pay, we have inflation, the 2.5% or 5%, whatever they're going to get. How are we going to incentivize our teachers to stay and be in the profession? We're losing some good people. So what about the budget, or what can we do to make that happen? How do we make our educators want to stay?
And I think actually the governor is announcing his budget. If he hasn't announced it, it's announcing today. And it will have more than the 2.5 in it for teachers. So I think teachers will be happy if that budget then gets carried through. You have to remember that we in the executive branch make a recommendation, but the legislative branch has to enact that, and that again depends upon those of us in the Divine Nine. We are the largest generation of educated African Americans this nation has ever known. There is no excuse for us not to harness that power, as we have seen our economic power cause corporations to change. There's no excuse for us not to harness that power and not harness our advocacy with the private sector and have private and the Divine Nine working together to say we need better education, and we have to make sure that we meet the needs of all of our students. And you can't do that without good public school teachers being able to keep and retain them. And so improving that salary is one thing, but I go back to what Representative Smith said. We also need to keep legislation out of the classroom. The fact is that when I walk in my classroom, I know my objectives. I spent a lot of time putting together that syllabus, figuring out what my objectives and what knowledge, skills, and abilities I need that student to have when they walk out of the room. Public school teachers do the exact same thing. Dan, do you still hear me?
Yeah.
Y'all back now. I messed up. I hit a button in the middle. Sorry.
All right, these students also were under the stress, particularly college students and their families, about jobs. If you had a job, you were under the stress of hoping that you didn't catch the disease. If you didn't have a job, you were under the stress of trying to make ends meet. And then let's don't forget, we sometimes forget there was an amazing amount of racial tension during this exact same period. And so you had a perfect storm of stressors. So as we say we're coming out of this thing, and I agree that there are projections that we may see some climbing. We need to keep in mind the mental health in particularly in the African American community, because all of these stressors had broader impact upon the African American community.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to move into that because that was one of my questions. So we're going to come right back to that, Secretary Penny. But I did want to introduce Mr. James Ford. I believe he is there. Hello, and he is on our state school board. Is that correct? Yes. So I wanted to get your input in. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we mentioned earlier, when you are at the level that you are, you were pulled into a situation. So definitely, I want you to weigh in on some of the things we've been talking about. How has COVID affected holistically the state? And especially we were talking about our children of color. And we definitely want to catch up and hear your viewpoint.
Yeah, so my apologies for being late. I actually had a committee meeting. But yeah, it's difficult to say in a succinct manner. And I'm sure others have probably captured the gist, but I think it's exacerbated pre-existing inequalities for folks of color. And whereas those gaps, those inadequacies may have been easy to paper over and ignore, we got put in a situation where, you simply could not avoid that anymore. The disruption to the learning process, the social and emotional impacts on young people. Also, I think it spelled out the importance of the education system as really the lifeblood of society. When schools shut down for a while there, you saw the true implications of how important school is. It is more than just school, right? Folks couldn't go to work, right? Folks couldn't do a bunch of other different things. And in some cases, for students who are experiencing poverty, they didn't have meals, right? And so I feel like as things have begun to open up, and as we've seen the mitigation measures that the schools did not take, it had huge life implications on the young people. I would venture a guess, and I don't have the data to substantiate this, that a lot of the fights a lot of even the shootings and the school-based violence that's occurred as a result on this side has something to do with the past year and or 18 months that we spent holed up in COVID. We know that our young people ain't well. They're not well. They've been suffering from depression. They have been responding to a collective trauma. And so I feel like if nothing else, it has forced us to confront the reality that, you know, school is not divorced from the larger community. And we like to talk about it like that some ways, like, well, just teach, just teach the subject. You can't divorce that. You can't divorce schooling from the context that young people and their families are situated in. Those two things cannot be teased apart. And if we talk about Black education, that's never been our orientation anyway, right? Pre and post segregation. The way that we taught was always in a way that was relevant to the lived experiences of young people. So that's what I would say I think came out of COVID is those, an urgent reality to respond to disrupted learning and a real need to be holistic in our approach.
Wonderful. And I was going to go to Superintendent. Could you speak to that as well? And now I want to move into the breakout rooms are popping up again. I'm sorry. I want to move into the mental health because we've got a lot of questions and comments in the chat that I'm going to go to in a few minutes when we start winding down. But I just want to hear, Superintendent, your perspective of mental health. It is a crisis. So tell us about some of the things you've seen and some of the ways you've tried to mitigate those things.
So we are seeing, to Freda Ford's point, tremendous levels of trauma in our students. It is not hard to see what the 18 months of isolation have done for students. Not just from an academic standpoint, but also from the social standpoint as well. And so what we're seeing is that it's taken a minute for students and in some cases teachers to get back in sort of a groove. If you think about it over the summer, and students take 2 or 3 months off, for the summer, schools are closed over the summer. And it takes the first 3, 4, 5 weeks to, folks sort of, get their motors going and that sort of thing. So imagine 18 months of being at home and that sort of thing. It is taking about a semester and sometimes more, to see students and teachers kind of get back into that rhythm, get back into that flow, where we're seeing students and teachers being engaged, energized in the classroom. The everything from the fights, the aggression, increased levels of suicide. We've seen all of these things sort of play out and manifest themselves in different ways. And it's the same thing that we see in our communities. We are struggling now, for example, between I think some of the ways that students both manage behaviors, sometimes even self-medicate, if you will. And so we're seeing students using edibles in schools, particularly now, add that to just what you normally see during the spring in this time in our schools. And there are lots of challenges that we're seeing. And so making sure that, as Representative Smith talked about, that we have the appropriate number of social workers, counselors, psychologists, nurses in our buildings to handle and address some of the things that we are seeing. But these are just some of the ways that it sort of manifests and plays out in a daily school environment. Bringing weapons to school is another. So I mean, there are lots of challenges in what we're seeing from a social emotional standpoint. I want to touch on too, just a part you were talking about earlier with respect to teacher salaries and how we can work to keep our teachers in a profession. Obviously, it starts with continuing to raise our salaries and provide more money for teachers to take home, particularly in our rural areas, helping out with the supplements on the local level that will help salaries to compete with our larger counterparts as well, but also increasing just the respect for the profession. A lot of it starts with that. There are many educators that are on this call that are both current and retired. Both of my parents were educators, and so we all can remember when teaching was one of the most, if not the most, well-respected profession in the Black community. We need to get back to that and recognizing the respect for the the profession. And when our students and young people talk about being a teacher, don't encourage them to say, hey, be a doctor, be a lawyer, go do something to make more money. It is still a noble profession to want to be a teacher. And we want to support our young people who want to be teachers and work in the classroom. But then there are other challenges that we see in our communities with respect to affordable housing and being able to provide housing to teachers as they, also like all of us are struggling with inflation, rising home costs, rising fuel costs, thinking about how we can be innovative and allowing remote working environments in some cases. So we have to be creative, I think, and innovative in ways that we can provide support and opportunities for our teachers as well. So just wanted to offer some of those challenges and what we're thinking about and offer an opportunity for folks that are on this call to be able to help us and support us in coming up with innovative ways and solutions to address some of these challenges.
And that, Superintendent Sutton, that is excellent. I'm listening to what everybody's saying, and I think the picture of that teacher that Representative Smith, I believe, said that is working at the extra job, and you see your teacher at Cheesecake Factory. We have got to invest in these teachers because they give their all during the day. They shouldn't have to go and side hustle, as they say at the college, to go and make ends meet. We have to invest in our teachers so they can in turn invest in the students. Excellent. So we've talked a lot. As we wind down with the questions, I want to save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So please, if you have any questions, please continue to put those in the chat, and I'm going to go back to those in a few minutes. But Mr. Ford, I just wanted to kind of go with you on this one. We've talked about negative Nancy all throughout this call. What positive has come, if there is anything you all can think of, from COVID, this situation with us, kind of immediately have to go to lockdown as we did for all those months? What positive at least came out of this from your perspective? And then I'd like to hear it from the others as well.
I will continue to say that the positive was that we were forced to reimagine schools at the drop of a dime, particularly in the rural areas like where Brother Sutton is at. Schools, and really in a moment's notice, without any real advanced planning, we're forced to figure out how do we connect school and home, because you just simply didn't have an excuse as a district to not know where your babies were. Mm-hmm. And so people were being deployed into communities. You had buses that were going out and delivering meals to folks, right? Never seen nothing like that before. You had people who were doing jobs that didn't necessarily fit their job description, but were in service to the mission of education in ways that, in my 41 years, I had never witnessed. And I think that it forced us to reconsider. In addition, I know we hated for, kids being at home the whole time. I got 4 kids, right? All of them was at home for a full year, so that's why you see this little gray hair on the side right here. But the truth of the matter is, for my son, he flourished in that environment. He flourished with the online remote. And so what it did for us, I think it gave us an opportunity to say, all right, every learner, although they're capable, doesn't learn the same way. And so if we can extract any possible benefits from out of that case study, it's that we might want to start thinking about the different ways that we can educate synchronously, asynchronously, remotely, and also what are the necessary supports needed, and what are the other ways that school can connect to community in ways that they didn't before. If a mama can't show up to a conference, you don't got no excuse now because you spent a whole year on Zoom. Give it a Zoom link, and figure out how to correspond with that family and that community. So those are some of the positives that I think certainly emerged from that moment where we were in the worst parts of
Mr. Ford. Okay, so I think it phased out, but wholeheartedly, you were right. And even Title I night, put a Zoom link up for that as well too, so you can get more parents there as well. So I'm going to work backward. Superintendent Sutton, what are your thoughts on that question? What positive came out of COVID as a superintendent? What positive did you have?
There are a lot of opportunities, but I think it's forced us to be intentional about so many of the things that we take for granted, particularly in our education system. I'll just use, as Representative Smith has talked about, sort of broadband access. If I'm in Raleigh, I can walk out of my door, get in my car, and I can have 5G service, 4G service, or what have you. You come to Warren County, we're only an hour and 10 to 15 minutes away, depending upon where you are in Wake County. And I've got 5G or 4G. Well, I don't have 5G, probably got LTE service in most places, but there's still pockets of my county where I have no G. And so if you have a mobile hotspot, Wi-Fi spot, it doesn't matter, because if you don't have a signal, then you're getting nothing. And we still have families and communities that are in some of those dead spots in the county. Now, long story short, if I'm looking for a Sprint or US Cellular or anybody, T-Mobile, to put service here, it's going to cost millions of dollars for them to either dig fiber optic cable and lay cable through Warren County, or hanging on a telephone pole or wire or what have you. When they spend those millions of dollars to do that, what they're looking for is a certain return on investment. So how many customers, how many subscribers will I have to offset the cost of me spending millions of dollars in laying fiber optic cable? They're never going to get that. In a Warren County or Scotland County or others, they're never going to see the return of investment they will need to justify laying that much fiber optic cable, which means somebody will have to at some point say, hey, we believe that families and communities deserve to have that broadband access, regardless of whether enough companies or businesses or residents will invest and subscribe in that. And that therein lies the challenge. And I think it's simple for many of those same companies to come in and put a cell tower on the roof of one of my most remote rural schools in the community. Now you'll have broadband access for those students, as well as all the homes and the residents in that area. But nobody's going to be willing to do that. So those are the challenges that we're seeing, but those also are the opportunities, to your question, in terms of what good is coming out of it, is how we can be intentional about having those conversations with broadband companies, with legislators, with investors who are willing to say, hey, we need to make sure that there's broadband access for every student, for every family, every part of the community, regardless of where you are. And so it's just forcing us to be more intentional and think about those things that we've taken for granted almost every day.
Wonderful. So Secretary Penny, how do we find the money? You're the money man. Find us this money so we can lay these fiber optics. How do we do it?
Well, you've got to remember the General Assembly has continued to reduce taxes in certain areas each and every year. And so we have to be more intentional about how we are in fact engaging in our taxing authority, and what we do need to do. But North Carolina as a whole, for the past 6 years, we have met our projections and exceeded those projections. We are a destination state where corporations are coming. What is important is that we continue to be that destination state, and the only way we can be that destination state is to have a strong public school system. Let's face it, corporations are not coming to a place where their children are going to get a second-class education. One of the benefits that COVID taught us is that we can do things in ways that we never thought we could do. That it forced us to be innovative, and it also forced us to go to something Mr. Ford said about his son, it also forced us to understand that the differently abled people, those who learn differently, can sometimes flourish if we just change the environment in which they have to work in. And so there are, in fact, areas within the Department of Revenue that actually produced better once we went home. I mean, I live in a world full of accountants, lawyers, and IT people. There are a lot of introverts in that world, and being able to go and do their work and not be bothered or only show up for a video meeting has made them happy. I'm gonna have to do a lot of inspiring to get some of these people to come back to a building because we realized we collected last year $39 billion at home. This year it will be more.
Wow.
But the good news, the other good news about COVID, I think, is sort of the bad news too. And that is the disparities that we've all been talking about became legitimate debate issues. And those issues would have denied the existence of them. But now they became so stark and so clear that they became legitimate debate issues. And the debate then had to be over how do we address them, not whether they exist. And I know that's a bad thing, but it's a good thing.
Wow. And Representative Smith, if you could round us out. And I have one more quick question before we go into questions.
Well, if I look at rounding us out, I think Secretary Penny just stated what I had just written down on my paper. I just said equity.
Yeah.
It allowed us to really have the push for equity, because a lot of people would have not had some of these conversations, and they would have made excuses and stated that, everything is going well. We've been doing the same thing we've been doing with getting money out to everybody, but not addressing those equities. Well, because of this pandemic, we've had to address these equities. I mean, when we look at it from health to mental health to economics to education, we've had to start addressing these this equity push and have these needed conversations. And I like how you put it, these disparity issues, because where at one time I can say in the General Assembly, it was not a conversation, because if you brought it up, it would be something stated as you just looking at it from one side. But when the pandemic happened and when it really hit at its highest rate, you saw a lot of people experiencing the same thing. And so they had to look at it and say, whoa. But when we start looking at numbers and they were just so prevalent, it could no longer be hidden. The need for equity is something that we have to continue to push, because when and if this pandemic ever ends, what I don't want us to do is go back to business as usual, because if we do go back to business as usual, then that means we're still going to be placed on the back burner. And then the issues and the things that we have in education and everything else will not be highlighted, would not be looked at, would not be considered, which means it would not be funded. And so we have to make sure that we continue to push for that equity. And that's why I go back again and will challenge everybody on these calls. The Divine Nine, you guys are key, because you're educated, you're in your communities. Your job is to be the arms for the community. And if your jobs are to be the arms for the community, you have to fight for that equity. When we start getting comfortable ourselves with our status, when we start getting comfortable with our position, when we start getting comfortable with our friends, and we don't say anything and we allow things to happen, that's the exact time when it turns and it flips on us. And then we begin to be part of the have an issue ourselves and start looking for what can we do. So am I my brothers and my sisters' keeper? Yes, we are.
And Representative Smith, you actually did it again. I'm just gonna have to pay you $20 or something after this call. That's what I was gonna ask everybody, but I think you summarized it for the group. What can the Divine Nine do? And you said it right away. Just get engaged, get involved. And my day job, as I say, as the Chief Equity Officer for the city of Greensboro, North Carolina, I co-sign what you said. We've got to have people in place and programs in place, get the data so we can act on the data so it can be sustained for years to come, what we need to do. So thank you. Perfect summary. That's why I said summarize it. I gave you that Delta love. Thank you so much. But as we wind down, everybody, there were just a few things, because I was told we need to start wrapping up in the chat, that I just wanted to just bring to light. How do we educate the constituents of the other side? This is one of the questions that I thought it was very, very important for you, Representative Smith, to help them understand that these issues, while there may be Black advocates, impact their children just the same. And I think we addressed that. We definitely need to educate on all sides to make sure that equity is there, like you just said. There are several comments about partnerships needed desperately with some of the counselors, small businesses, again, that was mentioned before, some of the counselors in the areas, definitely coming in and helping the schools. So just kind of putting that out there for you, Mr. Ford, kind of to hear. And I think broadband is talked about. So some of these we've already hit. So I just want to say on behalf of the committee that put this on for Legislative Day, thank you, Secretary Penny. Thank you, Representative Smith. Thank you, Mr. Ford. And is Superintendent gone? Superintendent
No, he's
Sutton?
there.
Oh, there you are. Okay,
Yeah.
you're right below me. I feel like I'm on the Brady Bunch. You're right below me. That's fine. See you. So thank you all so very much for your wisdom, for your knowledge, and just for being honest and open. As we said earlier on the call, this isn't necessarily representative of the comments of the D9. These are your comments, but these are our comments as a people, because we have to work together to fix some of these gaps that are happening, especially when it comes to our children. So I just thank you all so very much for attending today and looking forward to collaborating with you in the future.
And
So
let me
I
be-
would like to say thank you to you, Maria Hicks Pugh, for moderating this session. And thanks to all of y'all for helping make the Divine Nine Legislative Day what it is, because without you, we would not have a day. So thank you so much for giving us your time. The next session in this Zoom will be on healthcare matters. If you look in the chat, the links for juvenile session is in there, and then the link for the environmental session. So all of the different breakouts are on 3 separate Zooms. So if you exit this one because you want to go into another one, click on the link before you exit so you can actually put yourself into the new Zoom.
And let me just make sure I say one thing, because I know that people will probably have questions in the Divine Nine, like, well, what do we do and how do we know if there's something that we should do? I will say this: if you think it's an issue or if you think it's wrong, that means it is wrong. So you need to address it and not ignore it. And that's the thing when people always say, well, what can we do and how can we address it? When we start looking at this, the equity, if you think it's wrong, or you think it's an issue, that means it is.
I would add too, I think, if someone said, let's act and not react and that sort of thing, we have to continue to reinvent ourselves. We can't continue to do things as we've always done, or the way that we've continued to do it. But the pandemic has brought about an opportunity to reimagine education, to reinvent education. When I think about an example, and matter of fact, I'll say it here on this call, when you look at what Sarah Carey Dixon, Dr. Dixon has done at Elizabeth City State and reinvented what Elizabeth City State University is doing in education. It is a textbook example of reinventing an organization. And so just shout out to her and what she's doing. Member of Delta Sigma Theta, but what she has done is nothing short of amazing. But that's an example and type of thing that we need to do when it comes to reinventing and reimagining our organizations, our institutions, and education. And what she's doing is just remarkable. So just shout out to her and her team there. But I think that's just a fine example of what we have to do as we move forward.
I
Well,
agree.
again, I say thank y'all, and we are running into the next group's time. So I am going to turn it over to Marquita Lilly.
Thank you for that. So good afternoon, and thank you for joining the healthcare panel as part of the North Carolina Divine Nine Legislative Day. My name is Marquita Lilly, and I am the North Carolina Social Action Co-Coordinator for Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, and I would like to welcome you to this year's event. At this time, I would also like to send out a heartfelt welcome to our panelists for this afternoon. And I would also like for the panelists to go ahead and introduce themselves. And I will go ahead and start just in the order that I see on my screen. If we can start with Dr. Priscilla Ramseur.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Priscilla Ramseur. I am the Chief Nursing Officer at Duke Raleigh Hospital and been part of the Duke Health System for over 34 years. I am also a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority. I did my intake at North Carolina Central University with the Gamma Gamma chapter in 1984, and I'm now currently a graduate member with the Durham Alumni chapter. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much. Now, if we can have introduction by Ms. Shantae Keith.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to thank the Divine Nine Advocacy Group and specifically Marquita Lilly for the invitation to be here with you all today. My name is Shantae Keith, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Center for Black Health and Equity. I'll just say that the center has been around for about 22 years with a mission to provide comprehensive public health programs that benefit people of African descent. And our organization was originally founded to address the disparate impact that tobacco use has on the African-American community. But since that time, we've been very fortunate to expand to other issue areas such as cancer, HIV, food and nutrition, COVID-19, mental health, as well as women's health. So I do serve as the Deputy Director for the organization, and I assist our Executive Director, Domani Jefferson, in really operationalizing the strategic vision that's set by the board and the Executive Director. On a personal note, I am also a two-time breast cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer in 2016, and then again last July of 2021. And I just finished active treatment about a month ago. I finished radiation about a month ago. So I share my experience in hopes to inspire others to really advocate for themselves by doing things such as doing your own research and asking the right questions of your provider, getting second opinions if necessary, as well as feeling comfortable and transitioning to a new provider if it comes to that. But I also want to uplift these messages just to make sure that our pain and symptoms and concerns are not ignored, which for Black people often result in misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment, and that we have all the information that we need and the tools and the resources to advocate for ourselves. So again, thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Now we will have introductions by Dr. LaDonna Thomas.
Good afternoon, Ms. Keith. To God be the glory for your healing. Praise God. So I'm Dr. LaDonna Thomas. I am the Chief Nurse Practitioner for the Durham VA Healthcare Center, to include Durham, Raleigh, Greenville, and Morehead City. I am also a Care in the Community Coordinator for the Durham VA Healthcare Center. And I cover over 120 nurse practitioners. This is Nurses Week. So if you see a nurse practitioner, nurse midwife, wish them a happy Nurses Week. I am proud, and it is an honor to be here today. I am a proud member, a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. I just celebrated my 20th year anniversary on April the 27th. So that's a blessing in and of itself. So I'm honored to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas. And our last panelist for introductions will be Ms. Jessica Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Jessica Davis. I am a member of Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated, completing my intake at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke in the spring of 2003. I am a child welfare social worker and have been in this capacity for a total of about 7 years. between rural and urban North Carolina. I work with foster families and parents, children, in advocating for what they need and helping them to get the services that are needed for their reunification efforts.
Thank you very much for the introductions from all of our panelists. And so at this time, we'll just go ahead and dive into our conversation. At any time during this panel, if anyone in attendance has questions, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat, and we will try to get to those at the end. So just to go ahead and start off this conversation. So, you know, with COVID-19 pandemic, it's continuing, although things are starting to open up slowly or get back to somewhat normal. You know, we are still in a pandemic. And this can also be like a major threat to our public health system. So this can challenge the provisions of healthcare services and their accessibility. It reduces access to care, surgeries, and other hospital services. And so that has led to a significant decrease in the access to healthcare that we're seeing. So I want to address this to our panelists. So what can be done to increase access to healthcare scheduling options that will have a reduced waiting period? Because I know that I've heard that a lot of people have had problems with the long waiting periods, with getting access to necessary healthcare. So what are some things that can be done to increase this access to healthcare during this ongoing pandemic? And I'll first start off with Dr. Ramsour.
Thank you. This is truly an issue for us in healthcare. Since the pandemic, we know that there was a period of time where everything closed down except for the hospitals and providing urgent or emergent care. Surgeries were canceled unless it was urgent or urgent. And that went on for a long period of time. So there was truly a backlog. I actually experienced that myself as a recent total knee replacement patient. My surgery had to be rescheduled. And my surgeon, when he had to reschedule, he had over 100 cases to reschedule. So it is definitely an issue. The other challenge is there is not enough healthcare providers out there. We're noticing now that the majority of our healthcare providers are at that retirement age. And we've seen a lot of people, and I've actually seen a lot of nurses who they were eligible for retirement. They were experiencing burnout. They met the qualifications and they decided this is the time for me to retire. We lost a lot of experience with that, and we continue to do that. So we are definitely looking at how we are partnering with our nursing schools. Actually, my team and I here are reaching out to all nursing schools to have a stronger relationship, because actually there's several days where we just didn't have the capacity to even manage all our patients in the hospital. We are there now, but it took a lot. The market is very competitive. I'm in the Raleigh market, which my competitors are WakeMed as well as UNC Rex. It's nothing for our nurses to see that they can make more money at one of the competitors and they'll leave very quickly. We also know that we lost a lot of nurses for traveling. There was a period of time travelers were getting up to $200 an hour, or that's what we were paying. So that also impacts patient care because the downstream impact on that. We're now really looking at how we continue to be competitive. We know because of COVID, the numbers are decreasing across the country. The traveler use is not as prevailing as it was before, but it's still high. It's very high because a lot of hospitals just have not been able to recruit. There is a national shortage of nurses. So we really have to think about how we do work and partnering. But that starts also not just in the hospital side, it starts with our nursing schools. Our nursing schools don't actually have enough faculty as well, and that prevents a shortage. So from our side in the hospital, what we do is develop these relationships, but also provide clinical experiences for those nursing students can get the experience they need. So it is a full cycle from the hospital side, what happens, but I do know that same thing is going on in our ambulatory clinics. And we also have challenges with our providers being available as they need to. A lot of them have decided, I'm not working full-time anymore, I'm going to work part-time. And that's in our urban area like us. So when you look at rural areas where there's not a lot of opportunities, and I actually had a family member who needed care from Laurinburg, who continued to receive their care here, and drove even here because they just couldn't get in the local community hospital. So it is a challenge. We need to really think about what we do to start sharing more about healthcare opportunities to our in elementary schools. Years ago, when my daughter was in elementary school, we went there on career day and gave lots of opportunities. And we do continue to look at how we bring our local schools to the hospitals to share with them what the opportunities are, what are the partnerships. I have a strong partnership with the colleges here, as well as the community colleges in nursing. So that is just a small part of the work that we need.
Thank you for that response. I think a lot of what you touched on is very relevant as far as partnering with the nursing schools and things of that sort, and there being a shortage. Because I actually had my sister that graduated from nursing school yesterday, and she had multiple different job offers because of the shortage. And so I think that is exactly right what you're saying in response to that. And so I want to move on now to Ms. Shante Keith. The same question: what do you think can be done to increase access to healthcare scheduling options so that people are able to receive the care that they need in a more timely manner?
So I was just recalling the time when I was, before I was diagnosed with breast cancer for the second time. And it took a whole year before I got an ultrasound. My oncologist thought that the lump was scar tissue, and he did recommend the procedure, the ultrasound, but the appointment kept falling through the cracks. And when I was finally able to schedule one, I actually sat there and watched the scheduler make the appointment, and it took her 45 minutes to work it out. And it was because someone on the other end was coding the procedure wrong. And so my appointments were getting kicked out of the system. So one of the things that I was thinking about as a solution is for healthcare scheduling is maybe there could be a system that's implemented to follow up with patients, particularly because as the months passed leading up to the ultrasound, nobody checked on me to say, did you get the ultrasound? And if not, let's see how we can help in terms of scheduling and getting you back on track or seen for that particular appointment. I'd also like to say that I am under the care of Duke Medical, and so I do love Duke My Chart, which is a patient portal so that I can schedule my appointments. In some instances, though, I do have to request an appointment, which I think it would be great if the scheduling was in real time. That way, if it's done that way, then there's not a lot of back and forth, and I know that the appointment is done and scheduled. I think raising more awareness about using patient portals to schedule and communicate with our providers would be helpful as well. And lastly, I'll say, I think for me, one of the things that was really discouraging is when I was trying to schedule an appointment with a provider, there were, to Dr. Ramser's point, there are more patients, I think, than there are time slots available. So I know that that's frustrating for patients as well as healthcare providers. One way that I've gotten around that in the past year is identifying a backup physician, because oftentimes I will call to make an appointment and my provider is not available for like 2 to 3 months out. And I'm like, I need to see somebody, if not tomorrow, certainly in the same week. So I have done things like identifying another healthcare provider as a backup. So for example, if my son, his provider seems to always be booked up, I'll also always do my research to see if there's someone else in the practice that can see him in a timely manner.
Thank you so much for your response. So now I want to move to Dr. LaDonna Thomas. Being that you work with the veteran population, what are some things that you think can be done in that specific area to increase access to healthcare?
So it's a good question. And many of you may know long before COVID even existed, the VA, we were in the news for long wait times. I think it was around 2017, 2018 timeframe where they were talking about access to care for veterans. And this is an issue because these are our veterans who fought for our country, who fought for us. So it was an issue. So as I mentioned before, I work currently at the VA in care in the community. And what that means, I coordinate care for veterans who choose to stay within the VA system, or if they wish to go out to see another provider outside the VA. So we coordinate that care and they have that choice. So back in 2018, because of the wait times were greater than 30 days in some instances at some VA facilities, many of you can recall, a program called the Choice Act was implemented at VHA, Veterans Health Administration, and it was intended to give eligible veterans at that particular time access to private health care with, outside the VA. If VA wait times were greater than 30 days. And also for the veterans who live 40 miles away from a VA facility, not just at the main VA, if they didn't have a community-based outpatient clinic or a CBOC or a healthcare center within 40 miles of where they live, then it provided them that access as well. So then in 2018, if you can recall, the VA replaced the Choice Act because there were some issues with that, with what is now called the Mission Act. And that is an acronym for maintaining internal systems and strengthening integrated outside networks. So we have implemented that for a few years now, and it was signed into law and was launched by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs June 6, 2019. So, it has its mixed reviews. A lot of the veterans, I was speaking with a veteran the other day, and he said that he wishes to come back to the VA, and that's his choice. He can come back to the VA, or he can, stay in the community. However, there are some services that, of course, the VA, we just don't have, like acupuncture, chiropractic services, allergies. So we all automatically have to send those veterans out to the community. But that veteran that I was speaking with the other day that wanted to come back, his comment was, Dr. Thomas, the grass wasn't greener. The wait times that, the VA received such scrutiny over, and a few years ago, they're having the same wait times out in the community, if not longer. So he had to wait for his provider. It was, I forget what service he was seeing the outside provider for, the greater wait time, it was greater than 30 days. So he chose to come back to the VA, and we were able to accommodate him, and we were able to see him within a timely manner. So that way he could get the care that he needed.
Thank you so much for your response. And now we'll be moving on to Ms. Jessica Davis. So in your profession, in your capacity as a social worker in the area, what are some things that you think need to be addressed or could be done better to increase access to healthcare with the demographic of people that you are in contact with daily?
Thank you so much. So I want to point out and make sure we all understand that healthcare doesn't just involve the medical. It involves the mental health. It involves substance use. And there needs to be, to back to Dr. Ramser's point, the availability of providers for those services. Even in larger areas that you would think, they have plenty of services. We are still struggling to find providers to provide mental health. Or you have parents that you connect them with a mental health provider. They may see that provider for 3 months, and the next thing you know, they have a total new provider. So you have families, you have children and parents cycling around in the getting to know you area of mental health because there are not providers that are willing to stay with organizations. And part of that is because of funding. Part of that is because of willingness to work with Medicaid on behalf of providers. And part of that is just because if I can go get $10,000 more from a different organization, that's where I'm going to go. And so it has the families that I work with feeling like they are in a never ending cycle of where can I go and who's the next referral to. We have seen wait times of 3 to 6 months in trying to get children who have had trauma into therapy to address trauma. And then you have parents and foster parents saying, well, why is this child doing this? But we are all stuck in the limbo status. It is access to providers who are willing to provide what children need and what families need, adults as well.
Thank you so much for all those responses. I think that all of our panelists really hit on good points in all the different healthcare settings that they provide services. So I think that was very informative in letting us know some things that could be done better moving forward to increase our access to healthcare. And also to Dr. Ramseur's point, in order for us to, I guess, decrease the scarcity that we're seeing or the burnout that we're seeing with some healthcare providers is possibly by partnering with nursing schools or other organizations to ensure that people are getting access to healthcare that they need. So thank you for all of those responses. In addition to that, so the effects of the pandemic affected those not only who didn't contract COVID, but who have chronic disease. And so although the use of telehealth has helped, reduce exposure for patients and healthcare workers, there are still some issues like poor internet connectivity, device operability, regulatory restrictions, and so on and so forth. So I guess my next question for our panelists is, how has healthcare changed during the pandemic? As I mentioned, we have telehealth, but what are some other things that you have seen that have changed for the better, or maybe even, for the worse during this whole pandemic? And I'm just going to go ahead and start in the reverse order that we did for the last question. So I'll start this time with Ms. Jessica Davis.
So as a parent and as a social worker, telehealth has been both a gift and a curse. A gift in that those little things, right? So I think I have an earache. I think I have a runny nose. It's something small. I can go ahead and get to someone quickly. On the reverse side of that, we're all zoomed out, right? And if as adults we are zoomed out, our little babies are zoomed out. I think most of my 10-year-old, when he is in need of a medical appointment or a mental health provider, he's like, Mommy, the last thing I want to do is sit and talk to somebody on a Zoom. That connection, that one-on-one where Dr. Ramseur may see that this person is really hesitant in their body language. We don't get that through telehealth. I can give you the pretty face and the smiles, and you really not see what's going on with me as a whole. So I think as far as the telehealth option, it is a great option that was created because it allowed us to be able to maintain some sort of appointments. But there is the ability to have that personal touch that some people just need to address their issues. I can hide it. I've firsthand hidden, hey, I'm really not feeling well today. But being able to say, look, this is not, I may be fidgety, right? And I can't show you that through a Zoom call, or I can try to hide that, but to see that there is just having that one-on-one person connection. Also, as you hit on, the availability of internet services. I work with a wide range of persons, those who have access to internet and those who don't. Who wants to consider themselves to ride the city bus just for a Wi-Fi connection? I don't want my personal business, but we have parents and we have people in the community that have to use free Wi-Fi services. And I don't think that is available for everyone. When you think about rural North Carolina, if you're in Lewisburg, North Carolina, and you don't have access to the internet, what are you going to do? Who are you going to see at that point? And so it has been helpful in some circumstances and also detrimental in some circumstances as well.
Thank you so much for your response, Ms. Jessica Davis. Now I want to go to Dr. LaDonna Thomas. So I guess, what have you seen that has changed patient care during this pandemic, or how has healthcare maybe changed or evolved during this time?
So what's that saying? I think it was a song. They said it couldn't be done, then we did it. So they said we couldn't do telehealth or we couldn't do televisits, but we did, but when faced with no other alternative, we found that what was usually typically identified as a hard no turned into a maybe, then COVID hit, then it was a definitely yes. So for example, more barriers were removed because of telehealth visits. And then we did have barriers as, was discussed earlier, because of, connectivity. But typically, if you look at the history of telehealth, it's been around for a while, but it wasn't made possible or was not available for most individuals because, insurance companies wouldn't cover it. Right. So, then when COVID hit, they had no choice because, a lot of the people in the rural areas, they still needed, that connection to a provider for care. So the restrictions changed and we saw more people being seen, with telehealth visits. So I believe that when we look at, telehealth and how the COVID pandemic changed that for the patients, telehealth visits are making healthcare more convenient. Even with primary care providers, many of the providers, we had to go in during the pandemic. And then when, there was a breakout or even with and room availability, a lot of us were able to work from home. That was unheard of prior to the pandemic. You did not see a primary care provider working from home or doing like a video on demand with a patient. But now, like I said, they said it couldn't be done. Now it's being done. So we look at that as a positive aspect of the pandemic, if one could be identified.
Thank you so much for that. Now I want to move on with the same question to Ms. Shantae Keith. I know, at our previous question, you were telling the attendees, how you were undergoing treatments and everything like that. So I kind of want to get your perspective on, what changes you've seen with patient care during this pandemic. I know that you've touched on that a little bit, but if there's anything else that you would like to add.
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest changes for me, which was really a challenging time, was the limitation of family visitors, particularly during treatment. I was fortunate to have my mother. She was able to attend the chemo treatments, but during radiation, she did have to wait in the car. And one of the, again, most difficult parts was surgery. I remember when I was diagnosed the first time and when I had surgery, my whole family was in the room with me. So my mother, my brother, my cousin and my aunt, as well as my godfather and godmother, they were all in the room before surgery. And they were able to pray for me and give me some encouraging words. But this time around, I had 2 surgeries and no one was allowed back. And that took a really, it was an emotional toll on me. I was really feeling isolated and not having the presence or the warmth of my family was very difficult. So I know that visitor restrictions were a point of unease for a lot of patients during the pandemic. I'll also say that one of the biggest changes in patient care for me is there was a delay in medical interventions. I think that was said earlier, but I personally know some folks that had to stop treatment. And because, again, I talked about earlier, no one following up with those folks, they haven't gone back for chemo or radiation. So some folks have had to push back their mammograms, their colonoscopy, their pap smears, and dental care, which is a big one because of COVID-19. And so my primary care doctor even requested that I delay my annual physical so that I can avoid contracting COVID at the time. And so doctors, I know offices have had to really adjust tremendously during this time.
Thank you so much for your response. And to wrap up this question, I want to address it to Dr. Ramsour. So how have you seen patient care change in your healthcare setting?
Thank you for asking that. I will address it from a hospital perspective, and I will refer back to what Ms. Keith said about no visitation. When COVID first started, we had these stories about what was happening and how visitation may help will increase the spread. So immediately no visitors were allowed. That was difficult, definitely for our patients, but it was difficult for our nursing teams because we believe in holistic care and bringing the family in. So trying to do connecting families, we use iPads and Zoom. And again, like you said, that connection is not the same. And even we had consultations from some departments who only did it by Zoom. Again, a challenge. I will tell you, and I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but North Carolina passed the No Patient Left Alone Act, where everybody has the right to visitation. That includes if you're a COVID. So moving forward, no one will ever have to be without a visitor. Now, what hospitals have done is we have visitor limitations. So like right now, there was a time you only could have one visitor and at certain hours, the time of the day, and we had to know their names, we had to screen them. We do not screen as much as we did before. However, we do have unlimited visitors that can come, but only 2 in the room, only because of the fact of the COVID is out there. So there is definitely, but there is House Bill 351, which is something I would love for people to make sure, because it's interesting. A few months ago, I think someone was on Facebook and said they couldn't see their family member. So I inboxed them privately and said, you have the right to go see. And hospitals can be fined if they don't permit visitation. So make sure you're aware of that. Share that if you're aware from others. And then every hospital, and I do it all the time, I make exceptions to the rule. And I can tell you, it was a story of a young man, the whole family ended up having COVID. The father wasn't doing well. He was 21 years old. He didn't think he was going to make it. He asked the nurse, can my mother come? I don't know if I'll see my mom again. And the nurse called me. And I mean, as I was rounding, I said, yes, sure. The mother already had COVID, so there's no reason, or we could make sure we have her to dress appropriately. And I think what I would also encourage everyone to do is just raise your voice and go ask to speak to the next level. You can ask to speak to the hospital president or the chief nurse. And sometimes our team members are just trying to follow the rules, but sometimes we can change the rules and we have the authority to do that. So please ask. So I wanted to share that because the restriction on visitors is one of the things that we struggle with just as well. And I would tell you, we were excited about it. The only team that was struggling was how do we make sure anyone who came to see a family member with COVID knew how to protect themselves. So, and we just work with our patients and family members to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the responses from all the panelists, because what I'm kind of hearing a lot of the same things. So, speak up, if you have questions, advocate for yourself, as Ms. Keith had mentioned, ask questions. And Dr. Ramsour, I was not aware of the No Patient Left Behind. So I think that that's very good information for people to know, because I think a lot of times when people go into these healthcare settings and, someone on the staff says, oh, well, you can't have a visitor, people just kind of, just leave it there and they don't push it any further. So I think that's great that you are letting people know that exists, and they just have to speak up and ask. So
and that applies to long-term care facilities as well, not just hospitals.
Okay, thank you for that valuable information, because I'm sure that will be helpful to some of the attendees on the call today. So at this point, I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about health equity. So, the pandemic has brought certain inequities in healthcare to the forefront. And so some of this includes nearly 15 million Americans and their families who lost their healthcare insurance due to loss of employment, which caused people to have to apply for Medicare and other options for healthcare. And so at this point, for those who are attending who may not know what is health equity and the factors that affect that, I kind of want to start with Ms. Keith and address this question to you. What exactly is health equity and what factors go into affecting health equity?
Well, thank you for the question. So health equity is really the principle that every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, which is different from equality. Equality means that each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. Equity, however, recognizes that each person has different circumstances. And so we have to allocate the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. And so where I work, the Center for Black Health and Equity, we focus on health justice, which takes equity one step further. So we're looking at fixing the systems and laws that lead to long-term sustainable healthcare access for years to come. And so when we talk about health equity, we often include in the conversation the social determinants of health, which include factors such as income and social protection, education, job security, housing and basic amenities, transportation, early childhood development, as well as access to affordable healthcare services. And so for the work that we do, for example, we try to raise awareness, but we tell folks all the time, you can't tell a young person to go exercise outside if they don't have sidewalks. And you can't tell a young woman to eat healthier if they live in a food desert and they don't have access to healthy foods. So one of the other things that we also talk about at the center, we have a really good friend and partner. His name is Daniel Dawes, and he's with the Satcher Health Leadership Institute out of Morehouse School of Medicine. And he recently wrote a book called The Political Determinants of Health. So the political determinants of health include the politics, the economics, and the distribution of resources and power, and public policy that's really critical factors of population health. And so what Dawes explains in the political determinants of health is that, politics and public policy, they really create these social drivers, including poor environmental conditions and inadequate transportation, unsafe neighborhoods, and lack of healthy food options. All of these things affect our health. And so at the center, we are talking about, we're always talking about how we need to address the social determinants of health as well as the political determinants of health appropriately in order for us to improve the health outcomes of our people.
Thank you so much for your response. At this time, I will go to Dr. LaDonna Thomas. So as we're speaking about health equity, what are some things that you think that could be done to help close that, inequity gap that we're starting to see, or maybe that was more pronounced during the pandemic?
That's interesting. Thanks for the question. You should say that. This brings to mind, and we talk about equity and inequality, which is also the next question. This brings to mind what one of my 96-year-old World War II veterans stated to me a few years back. He was a poet laureate at his school, and he really loved poem, and he quoted the poem that was written by Russell Sharpe. And isn't it strange how princes and kings and clowns who caper in sawdust rings and common people like you and me are builders for eternity. Each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, a book of rules. Each must fashion ere time has flown, a stumbling block or a stepping stone. So I want to hone in on that last stanza where we talk about removing or eradicating stumbling blocks and creating stepping stones. And especially for our veterans and people of color, we want to remove that, whatever that looks like. And I think it's important for us to have dialogues, like platforms such as the Divine Nine Day, and other platforms that we have to talk about COVID-19 in the African American, Black and Brown communities. So we can, talk about what we need to do to remove these stumbling blocks and create these stepping stones, provide access, to care. Provide, like at the VA, we have a veterans homeless program. One of my line sisters, she's over that program. And, we have conversations with individuals in the communities about how we can form alliances with others to help these veterans and help people in situations like this. So I think just having a strong dialogue in the communities is a must.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. Now I would like to go to Ms. Jessica Davis. So I guess in your setting, working within the social services system, I guess what inequalities have you seen when it pertains to health, and what do you think can be done to kind of close that gap?
Thank you so much for that question. So as a social worker, here is what we see. Most of our population are those that don't have the availability to services. They are Medicaid recipients. And what you see is when you remove children from situations, that Medicaid is removed. So you have a mother that needs services, be it medical services, be it mental health services, and now she is unable to get those without some type of state funding. There is a state program out that allows parents to receive services. However, they're allowed 8 sessions of mental health services and 8 sessions between June and July. How much are you going to accomplish, right? What are you going to feel comfortable in saying to someone and you're only seeing them 8 times? For our families that have medical issues, what we see is they go without the services. We tell them, hey, look, I need you to take care of this. They don't know where to begin, right? And then there's also the stigmatism in the African American community of untrust in providers, be it healthcare providers or mental health providers. And so as an individual, I'm coming to them saying, hey, trust the system. I am the system, first of all. But then I want you to trust everybody else that I have to bridge the gap with. There has to be more of us. I need to be able to refer a parent to an African-American provider who can decipher what they're truly saying rather than using it as a hindrance to why they don't want to achieve a service. I need to be able to tell a child that it is okay for you to feel a certain type of way. And I'm going to take you to Dr. Thomas, and she looks just like you, and you can feel comfortable with seeing her. We do not see enough of us in mental health, enough of us in medical care. There are not enough of us. And that would help, I think, build some of the bridges to inequality, is to have more providers that look like us. And it starts at the school level. It starts when they're in elementary school to stop, you often hear little Black and brown boys are encouraged to go be athletes. What about a doctor? What's the backup plan, right? Yeah, I want you to do this, but what are you going to do if that doesn't go through? As a social worker, part of what we do is I tell people I'm an unlicensed therapist in so many ways. I'm going to coach you to this next person. I'm going to talk to the doctor for you. I'm going to let them know what you got going on. But there's not enough African-American therapists that parents can trust and feel that they need to trust.
Thank you so much, Ms. Davis. And I would also like to wrap up this question with Dr. Ramseur. So what things do you think could be done in order to kind of close that health inequity gap that is present?
Thank you. And I totally agree with my co-panelists, because all those responses are definitely relevant. It is a huge challenge. The one thing I recently, since I've been in my role here, is every county does what we call a community health needs assessment, and everyone has an opportunity to look at that information. I would actually encourage you to learn more about that, and then understand how your organization that you're working at is supporting or partnering with those priorities. one of the things we learned, and we just didn't realize it, but transportation, even though we have what we call access a ride, where people can be taken for care appointments, they're limited in their staff, and so they will drop them off, and someone may be sitting somewhere 4 to 6 hours waiting for someone to pick them up. I cannot tell you how many times our staff have just decided we'll just pay for a taxi to get you home, or we will pay for a taxi to get them home, because sometimes that patient is being just so calm and not saying anything till someone says, you know, you were here 2 hours ago, can I help you? So as we observe things like that, reach out and see what we can do to support. As Dr. Keith mentioned earlier about the fact that it is how we look at all the social and political determinants of health. It starts at the time that child is born and what that mother have access to, what is in your community. And I think as we continue to look at how we support our communities, is going out to see how we have conversations in some of our, what we call lower performing schools, even though they're just been maybe titled that way, but how we're going into those schools and supporting them. And what can we provide for them? I was sharing, a friend of mine shared where they were giving out book bags, you know, earlier this school year. And this child came and when she gave her the book bag, she said she hugged her and just said, can I take a picture with you? Because she said, you look like me. So again, that makes a difference. And so being visible and supporting and sharing, there's a lot of opportunities in healthcare that people don't think about. And some of them, you know, it's just a matter of introducing them to all the opportunities. And that's why I like to bring students on our campus to say, hey, do you know what a perfusionist is? Do you know what is a phlebotomist? And, you know, or that you can be a radiation oncologist, or what is dosimetry? Just all those opportunities that are out there that I didn't know about. I knew about a nurse and a doctor in the hospital, and that was about all I knew coming from rural Eastern North Carolina. And the world is big. And so how do we keep sharing with them what those opportunities are? And then how do we support our communities? There's so many ways we can do it. I could talk all day about this, but learn about your community health needs assessment and how can you partner with that?
Can I add to this conversation, Marquita?
Absolutely.
I just wanted to just say that I was thinking about my dad, and his name was Larry Keith. And at the time that he passed away, he was the assistant dean for admission and associate director for the Office of Educational Development at UNC Chapel Hill. And so he was also part of the MED program. And my father's life work was helping countless underrepresented minority students get into medical and dental school. And so I was thinking about, you know, how we can have opportunities to continue his legacy, and so many others that are choosing to do mentorship and creating opportunities for young people to go to medical school, as well as nursing school and dental school. But also to Dr. Ramsey's point, there is so many opportunities in healthcare, as well as public health. And so our young people really need to be exposed to just all the different things that that make up public health. Like they can be in program management, they can be in public policy, epidemiology. One of the areas that we really need, and someone in the chat said representation matters, we really need more Black evaluators. So the field of evaluation and data collection is mostly white. But we need people of color that can do culturally appropriate, responsive and equitable evaluations. You know, folks that know how to ask the questions, conduct focus groups, and gather data insights through innovative and culturally appropriate ways. And then I also just wanted to uplift that we're living through multiple pandemics at the same time. So we have COVID-19, but we're also experiencing the racial tension, the racism, the economic uncertainty, the police brutality, And you all know how tense it was during the time of the murder of George Floyd, who had really brought a light to the social and racial injustice in this country. And so before the pandemic, Black folks were already off the chart for cancer, diabetes, heart disease, uterine fibroids, maternal and infant mortality, as well as HIV. So these things continue to persist in our communities for several ways. So when you talk about closing the gap, like what are some things that we can do? I would say the first thing is we got to talk about the isms. More particularly, we have to uplift that racism is a public health crisis, and it's the foundation of why these health inequities are continuing to exist and persist in the first place. So we have to address racism on the personal level in terms of physician implicit and explicit bias, but also institutional and structural racism. I'd also say that for the center, we focus on equity-centered policies. So yes, we want to get folks out to vote, but after the vote, we have to raise awareness to tell our communities that at the local level is where the magic happens. So it's not just about voting in the general election, but really getting out in the midterm elections as well. We also talk about, in terms of equity-centered policies, intersectionality, that Black folks are not a monolith. We're typically Black and woman or man, Black and LGBTQ, Black and veterans, Black and physically disabled. So making sure that we have those voices at the table as we're pulling together these public policies, I think are paramount. And then I also just lastly wanted to uplift that one of the things that we have to do to close the health inequity gap, there's an elephant in the room that has crept up over the years and it can no longer be ignored. And that is mis and disinformation. So false claims and lies that are spread through social media are extremely harmful to our people. I know you all know some of the myths that were going around about COVID-19 and the vaccine, but certainly giving folks trusted resources so that we can combat some of these lies or false information that we're seeing, I think is important as well.
Thank you so much for all the panelists' response, especially thank you, Ms. Keith. And that actually made me, kind of just want to chime in quickly. For those of you all who don't know, I'm a scientist and my background is in vaccine research and development. And that was something that we had a really difficult time dealing with whenever the COVID-19 vaccine became available, and encouraging people of color to feel comfortable actually getting the vaccine. And so we had to, of course, like you said, address misinformation that was out there about the vaccine. It also helped that we looked like the communities that we were going into. So I think that that was very helpful. And then we tailored strategies specific to whatever community that we were reaching out to, and then building partnerships with other organizations as well. So I think that everything that everyone on the panel said was absolutely correct. And now as we are, ending towards our closing time for this panel, I just kind of want to close out with one final question. And although we've only been able to scratch the surface here when it pertains to healthcare in the midst of a pandemic, I would like for each panelist to take about 60 seconds to just close out with this question. So what lessons have we learned from this pandemic that could help us prepare for the next big event as it pertains to healthcare or patient care? And I'm going to go ahead and start this one with Dr. Ramsour. And if you could just take about 60 seconds. Thank you.
So I would say, number one, use our voice and use our resources. Don't be afraid to speak up. Also be creative and be innovative. That's what we had to do to survive in the healthcare world, is to say, no one's hearing me, but I'm willing to do this. I think we have to then also remember, as Ms. Keith was saying, the racism is still real. And people do sometimes have biases. And so how you have to speak up and use your voice is going to be most critical. But also let's focus on taking care of our community to make it a healthier community. I would just say that mental health is real. And how do we support people? And I think in our community, we sometimes say that we'll pray for you, then instead of trying to get real help. Let's provide the help that people need. And I will say, I'll tell someone, I need a therapist. I need to have someone to come talk to me because I'm struggling. And so the reality is, burnout and stress is real, and it will hurt you if you don't take care of yourself. So take care of yourselves is what I've learned most, and how to really balance the fact that this work will always be here, but there's only one of us and one of our loved ones. So take care of each other.
Thank you so much for your response. Now we'll have 60 seconds from Ms. Keith. So what lessons have we learned from this pandemic that could help prepare us for the next big pandemic, big event as it pertains to healthcare or patient care?
I'll uplift two things. I think the first is that we need to invest more in public health. And healthcare. I think COVID has shined a light on how fragile our healthcare system is, and frankly, how this country and the world was just not prepared for the pandemic. So we had far too many health departments that were working on the front lines that didn't have the appropriate equipment or the staffing or the training. So we do need to invest more in public health infrastructure, including the workforce, and then operationalizing health equity in our healthcare system, as well as modernizing data, as well as investing in our physical infrastructure. And I also just wanted to say one of the lessons learned is because I'm so passionate about this organization that I work with. It's called Compassionate Choices. And they are a national organization that is out of Washington, D.C., and they talk about the end of life. So the pandemic really shifted how we talk about the end of life at the beginning of the pandemic. And in some instances now, people were dying in the ICU with no loved ones around them, which was traumatic for them and the families. And we are a celebration of life people. So we weren't able to go to church services. We were having graveside services, and we weren't able to gather for repasts. And oftentimes patients in the ICU were not prepared for the end of life, particularly when their circumstances declined really rapidly. So we need to have conversations in our community about end of life options, estate planning, power of attorneys, hospice care, because one of the things that really is burdensome on our community is when we're unprepared, it really puts a financial and emotional stress on our families. And so I did want to just lift that these are some conversations that we really need to have. At the center, we talk about, how we can improve health outcomes for our people from the beginning of life, but we also need to go all the way through the spectrum and really talk about how we can improve health outcomes at the end of life as well.
Thank you so much for your response. And so now we'll go to Dr. LaDonna Thomas, followed by Ms. Jessica Davis. If you could just quickly tell us, what is, I guess, the biggest lesson learned from this pandemic on changes to healthcare or patient care that we can take into the next big thing?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think just trusting in science. As an African-American community, we trust in God, and which is what we're supposed to do, right? But I think a lot of people, they had a conversation, I don't trust this, I trust in God. But I think God gives us common sense, and he gives us the wherewithal to understand that he sends people in our path to work as he works through them to help us with, with pandemic, with vaccines, like you, Marquita, who, you work with the vaccines as a scientist, the physicians, the nurses, and everybody. And then I think Ms. Keith talked about earlier is eradicating the mis and disinformation. We were not always provided with the correct information, and that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And I can understand that. And so we did not trust as much as we should. And given our history as African Americans, that just exacerbated the situation. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you very much for your response, Dr. Thomas. And Ms. Jessica Davis, if you could just give us about 20, 30 seconds, your biggest lesson learned that you would take into the next pandemic as it pertains to healthcare or patient care?
So be prepared for change. Be prepared and be accepting of change. Nothing in life is constant, and we have to be willing to evolve ourselves as much as possible for when the next thing happens. We can't stay stuck where we are and the ways that we were doing things. We have to be open to changing how life looks. One of my professors said the biggest thing I can take with me through life is every good therapist has a therapist. Do not be afraid of mental health. It is real. It can harm you in the littlest way possible. It's not just a mental thing. It is a body thing. It leads to you seeing a Dr. Ramsor or Dr. Thomas. So take care of your minds first. Remember to get out and vote. Our vote is our voice. It starts at the local level. If we can't change our local politicians, we can't change the world.
Well, thank you. I mean, with that closing, I guess I have nothing else to add to that. So at this point, I want to thank all of our panelists who were present with us this afternoon. Thank you for all the attendees. Thank you for continuing to support the North Carolina Divine Nine Legislative Day. And at this point, for those who are staying on, we will be transitioning to our closing session. So again, thank you so much for your support, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you.
And the link for the closing session is in the chat. So if you close out of this Zoom and click on that one and start that one, then you can actually join into the closing session. And they're running over on their last session too. So they'll still be talking when you get in there. Thank you. Have a
Thank you so
great
much.
afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.